Hi everyone, my name is Lily Thornburg and I chose to do my presentation over the fraud scandal surrounding college basketball right now. I know my favorite time of the year, and probably some of yours too, is March Madness. Seeing the committee pick the top 68 teams, watching small schools have a shot at a Cinderella story, and those big name blue bloods battle makes me glued to the TV and stream every game I can. In the years to come, March Madness could look a little different, all thanks to some fraudulent activity, including under-the-radar payments to players and coaches. To get you more familiar with the investigation, we'll treat it like a game. First, I'll introduce you to some key players, and then next, we'll cover the game plan. The game plan will include the different indictments, cases, and essentially help us unfold the case, while the results will show us who wins or loses after this whole unraveling of corruption in college basketball is finished. And if you're a former athlete like myself, you all remember hearing the "it's just a game" speech from parents and coaches alike after a tough loss. In this portion, I'll discuss how this whole investigation relates to what we've learned over the past 8 weeks. Stay tuned. To start off, I'll introduce some key players. There are many names to know throughout this whole case, but I'll brush the tip of the iceberg and get you familiar with just a few. First, the NCAA. The NCAA, as most of you are already familiar with, stands for the National Collegiate Athletics Association. Founded in 1906 as the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States, they hold power over 3 divisions of collegiate athletics: Division I, II, and III. They serve as the general legislative and administrative authority for all 3 of those. In 1910, they adopted their current name and 11 years later held their first national championship event. They are in charge of 1,117 colleges and universities, over 100 athletic conferences, and 40 different sports organizations. Typically, the NCAA handles cases of academic fraud, high school eligibility and transfer eligibility, and occasionally illegal payments and benefits to players. The NCAA was unaware such an investigation was going on and has been told by the FBI to hold off on any sanctions or consequences until the investigation is complete. Our second key player is kind of a big one. The FBI was founded on July. Next, ASM Sports. At the head of ASM was Andy Miller and Christian Dawkins. Andy Miller started off as a prominent NBA agent and ended up founding ASM Sports. Miller worked with NBA players like Kevin Garnett, Kristaps Porzingis, and Kyle Lowry. Christian Dawkins, on the other hand, was an employee and executive under Miller who was found conspiring with assistant coaches who have since been terminated. According to Yahoo Sports, Miller and Dawkins were arranging 4 to 5 figure payments to high school and college basketball players. Both had computers and other equipment seized by the FBI and relinquished their duties amid the basketball scandal. Miller and Dawkins aren't the only 2 involved, though. Others, such as James Gatto, a high-ranking Adidas employee, and Merle Code, an Adidas consultant and former Nike employee, are also involved. Colleges and universities all across the nation are involved in this investigation. The sizes of schools differ greatly. Smaller mid-major schools like Wichita State and big-name basketball blue bloods like Duke and Kansas are named in the FBI's documents. A number of schools are named for potentially giving players and their families impermissible benefits or preferential treatment. Impermissible benefits are defined as goods or services based on their status as athletes. These benefits can be cash, goods at low or no cost, or special treatment, all because of their status. Some of the schools involved in that portion of the investigation are Kentucky, Seton Hall, Washington, and NC State. Other schools with both active and former players are under investigation for being listed in Christian Dawkins, a former ASM executive's expense report. He was seeking reimbursement for the thousands of dollars that he had given players and their families. The schools involved in that portion of the investigation are Kansas, Louisville, Wichita State, Alabama, and various others. The most widely known case thus far is Louisville and Rick Pitino, but we'll get more into that in just a few minutes. Now that we're familiar with some key players, let's get to know the game plan, or how the whole investigation is unfolding. The first indictment came about on September 26, 2017. 2 men were arrested, including Gatto, who I previously mentioned was the Adidas employee. 4 of those 10 men were assistant coaches: Lamont Evans at Oklahoma State, Chuck Person at Auburn, Tony Bland at USC, and Emmanuel Richardson at Arizona. The other 6 men included managers and financial advisors. This first indictment hit Louisville and coach Rick Pitino and Brian Bowen the hardest. Here we can get a better understanding of one stage of the whole scheme. The coaches were directing these players and families to these managers and advisors, who in turn were paying the coaches for their involvement. For instance, Evans at Oklahoma State claimed that he took care of each and every kid like they were his personal kid. Evans was expecting $2,000 per month from Dawkins or Sood for his services, but could ask for $5,000 to $7,000 at the end of the day for delivering. Next, we'll see how the apparel company was involved. On the other half of the fraud scheme, we can see here that colleges were providing athletic scholarships to the athletes, and through their commitment to the apparel company, Adidas and James Gatto, these athletes were receiving cash payments. In return for these star athletes and their commitment to Adidas, the apparel company was offering more and more sponsorship deals to the universities. Think of some teams that are sponsored by Adidas: Kansas and Louisville. As I mentioned before, the first indictment hit the University of Louisville the hardest. Louisville was found funneling payments to player Brian Bowen, a 5-star recruit and McDonald's All-American right out of high school. This was to ensure his commitment to Louisville and help ensure that he would sign with Dawkins and Adidas upon entering the NBA. They concealed these payments by writing that they were for an AAU travel team expense, or delivering portions of the payment in cash. Not only did Brian Bowen end up having to transfer, but head coach Rick Pitino and athletic director Tom Zurich lost their jobs. The second indictment was publicized around April 10, 2018. The FBI released similar charges and suspicions, describing illegal payments and benefits to players and their families. Most notably, in the second indictment was the University of Kansas and North Carolina State. Both descriptions didn't name players, but after further research and consideration, many people linked the unnamed players to Silvio De Sousa, Billy Preston, and Dennis Smith Jr. The University of Kansas is also a large piece of the puzzle. The FBI investigated paperwork of, again, Christian Dawkins and James Gatto, finding another AAU team's travel and tournament fees that could ultimately sway another high-profile recruit to surprisingly commit to Kansas. Multiple payments and wire transfers were found, but also cash withdrawals and payments to ensure his commitment and loyalty to Dawkins and Gatto among entering the NBA. According to court documents, the mother claimed she was offered money by a rival athletic apparel company and needed money from Gatto and Adidas to turn down the other apparel company and affiliated school and ultimately commit to Kansas. Again, Louisville and Kansas are not the only schools mentioned in the investigation, but definitely big pieces of the puzzle. Now, let's discuss how this investigation could impact all involved. Participating in a fraud scheme may seem like a win-win situation, but it really isn't. All 4 of the assistant coaches, as well as head coach Rick Pitino and Tom Zurich, athletic director at Louisville, were mentioned in the first indictment and have since lost their jobs. Miller and Dawkins, as well as the assistant coaches, are facing charges and could be sentenced to a maximum of 80 years. For the players, they're risking their eligibility, or the opportunity to compete for their university. Not competing at all is quite the change from getting paid to compete. For the universities, if or when they are found guilty, they could be forced to forfeit games in which ineligible players participated. For Kansas, this could mean giving up their 14th consecutive Big 12 title and their recent Final Four appearance if the assumptions of players are correct. But for the NCAA, it could change things quite a bit. This investigation forces a conversation to be had, to pay players or to get rid of the one-and-done rule. This forces the NCAA to look at options. Some of these kids are coming from struggling homes but are forced to go to college for at least a year until they can make millions in the NBA. Will the one-and-done rule continue to be enforced, or will players get paid? This investigation puts that discussion out on the table. Now, let's talk about how this fraud scheme relates to how we've spent our last 8 weeks. This entire scenario relates greatly to our fraud triangle that our book describes on page 35. These players have perceived pressure, either by their family, their upbringing, or the idea of the items they could buy with the payments. They are pressured by the school and coaching staff to lie. How could a top recruit come to the school and not get cleared by the NCAA? They had to avoid being a bust. They have perceived opportunity. Clearly, they are being offered for doing something they've done all their life: play basketball. It couldn't be traced, they were told. Hand-delivered cash or lies on expense reports, nobody would know. And of course, it was rationalized. Various players were taking this money to ensure a better life for themselves, to give their family gifts to show the appreciation for the sacrifices they've made to do what they love. Obviously, there are some different tips to help guide the FBI to the investigation. Our book describes in Chapter 5 the symptoms of fraud. I think in this case, all of these were clear. There were clearly faulty journal entries and accounting anomalies, especially in Christian Dawkins' expense reports. These players also began affording things they couldn't before. For instance, right before season, Billy Preston was seen driving a Ferrari around campus, and around a week later, the NCAA began an investigation on how he acquired such an expensive car. 5 months into the investigation, Preston gave up the fight and went overseas to play professional basketball, foregoing his collegiate career at Kansas. Of course, the overarching theme here is corruption. Our book describes corruption as one of the oldest white-collar crimes known to mankind. This specific kind of corruption happening here is bribery. Athletes were taking payments to attend certain schools, and coaches were taking bribes to help sway these athletes into deals with certain apparel companies, financial advisors, and NBA agents. This would fall under the definition of commercial bribery, which on page 523 of our book is described as when something of value is offered to influence a business decision. And finally, I just want to thank you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for such an interesting and useful course. Best of luck, everyone.